Again, I would say this was a bit of a distinction between some of the larger, more established brands and these smaller growth style brands. When you have a smaller marketing budget, you're counting on every single dollar, and that, getting the ROI out of that dollar, because you better believe someone's going to be asking, how much money did you spend and how much did we get? I think at some of the larger brands, there's probably just a little bit more room for waste. I remember Paul McNulty was a CMO of Unica, and I remember one point early on, I was working with him, and he said, "Tammy, why are we paying double for what anyone else would be paying for these media buys and ad campaigns?"
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
I started by writing ads in the newspaper and brochures, and I still have a special place in my heart for print and will argue till I'm blue in the face the value it has for building trust with customers. However, as a writer, I can't help but acknowledge digital marketing and its advantages, and one that stands out to me most strikingly that I love as a creative, as a writer, is that instant feedback loop from your audience that digital can provide, that insight into your audience from analytics. Our latest guest shared a similar lesson in her podcast guest application. She worded it this way: teams that are steeped in data and conversion numbers are the strongest at the craft. I even love the usage of the word craft when we're talking about data and analytics. I look at marketing as a craft as well. Here to share the story behind that lesson, along with many more lesson-filled stories, is Tammy Cannizzaro, the Chief Marketing Officer at Thryv. Thank you for joining us, Tammy.
Thank you, Daniel. Happy to be here.
Well, Tammy, I was looking at your LinkedIn. You have a long and illustrious career. I'm just going to pick off a few of the top roles here, but I could go on and on. You were Vice President of Marketing for Cloud at IBM, Head of Marketing at eBay Enterprise, Vice President and Head of Marketing for North America at Oracle, Vice President and Head of Global Demand at CA Technologies, Chief Marketing Officer at Komodo, and right now you are the CMO at Thryv, where you manage a team of 50. And Thryv is a publicly traded company on Nasdaq and recorded $1.113 billion in revenue in 2021. So Tammy, tell us, what is your day like as CMO at Thryv?
Well, it's exciting because we're targeting SMB, and SMB is, rather than being a single cohort, it's, many cohorts, right? There's a difference between, professional small businesses like doctors and lawyers who have small local businesses, and then plumbers or contractors or roofers. So it's been a fun exercise in terms of targeting SMB. The other interesting space about SMB, the other interesting thing about SMB is that they act like consumers. So I kind of consider Thryv at the intersect of B2B and B2C. And so it's been exciting really working to build ourselves as the category leader for this, for this set of businesses.
Well, great. So I think anyone listening can learn a lot from you today. There's B2C, B2B marketers listening. There's folks that target SMB. As we talked about, you've worked for some of the biggest enterprises on this planet. So I think we can all learn a lot from you. And actually, your first lesson kind of goes along with that. You said there is a dramatic difference between marketing for a company with a large established brand versus a company building a market presence and entering a category. So how'd you learn this lesson, Tammy?
Well, I first noticed this phenomenon when I was at IBM, and, I really grew up in marketing at IBM, and IBM obviously having a very large recognized brand. Maybe 10 years into my career at IBM, my general manager started a new division, and it was 100% made up of small acquisitions. And so I had a chance to work with these CMOs from, let's say, sub $500 million, SaaS companies, newer brands that weren't as well recognized in the industry. And there was a dramatic difference between the marketing style at IBM for an established brand and the marketing style for these smaller, what I'll call growth style companies. There were pros and cons, but I really was able to tell what a dramatic difference there was in marketing between the two different types of companies. That the power of the brand and also a very large sales force made it made digital marketing not as mission critical, right? IBM wasn't going out of business if we didn't get digital right? If we didn't get social right. Whereas these businesses, literally needed to make revenue, and they were dependent on that marketing team for that breakthrough thinking to build themselves, into a category.
Yeah, let me ask you, this is one major difference I noticed between big brands and small brands. So a lot of small brands, they'll see a big brand, what they're doing, and they'll try to copy. They'll see what Apple is doing and try to copy it, or IBM, right? But your point is, it maybe that technique wouldn't work for them because they don't have that big brand behind it. And I thought, here's one example where I thought, so when your PR rep first reached out to me and I saw your name, Tammy Cannizzaro, like I said, I kind of remembered it in some way, right? I'm like, I think I know her in some way. And then, I searched our names together and I found out, oh yeah, I did a panel in a marketing Sherpa summit in San Francisco 10 years ago. You were on that panel. I kind of remember, had a good experience, and that gave me kind of more of an impetus to want to reply to you, right? That brand sticking out. And actually, you're asking about my name. I think this is an upside for names like mine and yours. Like, I don't know about you. When I was a kid, Daniel Burstein was not, I wanted him to be Bob Smith, right? I don't know if
Same.
Right. Tammy Cannizzaro. I love it. It doesn't roll off the tongue. And so, but now in this era, I'm glad I'm Daniel Burstein. And you mentioned if I go by Daniel, and I do because there is a Dan Burstein who's an author. There is a Danny Burstein who is on Broadway. So I am Daniel Burstein. So people can find me on social media and whatnot. And I would say for anyone listening, it's a quick branding lesson for yourself. I always use the example of David Meerman Scott. He's Dave Scott, right? But if he was Dave Scott, no one would remember him. So he's like, I'm David Meerman Scott. So
it's a great example.
Brand yourself. Tammy and me have naturally done it, but if you have a common name, do it yourself. But anyway, so back to my question. I see like a lot of those small brands, they'll always want to mimic the bigger brands and they'll do the same marketing techniques. But to your point, they don't have the sales force. They don't have the brand recognition. And so you could look at something that would work perfectly well for an Apple, for an IBM, whatever, is going to blow up in their face. So have you found that as well? Am I off on this? What do you think?
I completely agree. Many product managers over the years have said, I really want like Apple. I want people lining up the doors for this product launch, and it's it's sort of a little bit night and day, right? Because, it's just a very different phenomenon. And one of the things I learned early on from these growth style brands is that you do need to be more breakthrough. When you're an established brand, you can afford to just kind of get the fundamentals right and have a nice brand, run some nice commercials. You've got a big sales force, you get the product messaging and the product's halfway decent and you're off to the races. In some of these smaller brands, it's a dogfight. There are, when IBM purchased Unica and Coremetrics, they were in such a dogfight out in the market that they didn't want to sit together at the same table, because they really felt, that their brands were fighting against one another. And I do think you really need to, be maybe a little bit more aggressive in your marketing tactics. When the CMO of SoftLayer came in, he showed me this new ad campaign, and it was, "We're going to kick the sass out of you." And I said, "Oh my God, Nathan, this is never going to fly at IBM. We have these very strict brand guidelines, and this is not going to fly." And he said, "Well, Tammy, you need to be breakthrough. We can't run these, sort of, lukewarm, sort of feel good ads. We really need to break through in this category." And it just was a very, very different type of thinking.
Right, and with IBM, with that huge sales force, it's like, well, if we bought this now, if you could just introduce it into some of your accounts, it will probably make our numbers for the year.
Exactly.
It brings up the other point. So as a marketer, how have you felt working at some of the biggest brands like IBM and Oracle? And you don't have to say anything good or bad about anyone specifically, but versus getting to work at some of these smaller brands. Because I know me personally, I worked as a contractor for IBM. I didn't work directly for IBM. I was a contractor. I was in Software Group. It was one of those acquisitions. It was Rational Software, and wow, what an experience. I mean, first, their sales methodology is second to none, and the people they had in there, oh my gosh, it's fantastic. But also, I worked on an internal sales enablement team, right? So I worked on like this little bit of, so I could, like, changing an internal Lotus Notes newsletter was a major accomplishment that took a month and, like an SVP or someone to get involved, you know what I mean? Versus when I've gotten to work with smaller brands where you are, literally sitting there with the founders, with the discoverers, and helping figure out the value proposition and the business strategy. And so, I'm not saying one is right or wrong. It probably depends on the person, but what has been your experience? Like, what is your advice for other marketers of working in those global, enterprise companies versus working for those smaller brands?
Well, one of the beautiful things about working for IBM was that they moved you around every year and a half. So, and they would move you around without any experience. So I'll never forget running social media for one of the brands, and I had never been on social media, which is kind of dating myself, but that's the truth. And I really had to learn it. And I started tweeting, and I started building a follower, and I started meeting with influencers and asking them, to help me, understand the game a little bit more around really using influencer marketing and social media marketing. Those early days, I got lots of influencers together. And I think because I was from IBM and I had a fairly large budget, I was able to reach out to, influencers and run major marketing programs and build categories at IBM. That said, I think the real growth marketing and really building a category for a brand and driving digital inbound marketing for me is more exciting, because you're, at IBM, you're sort of, I don't know, you're adding a few cents to the bottom line, right, of a massive company, whereas when you're in these growth brands, you're really at the table. And just, I found folks just passionate about, we're not only coming to report for a job, we're building a company. And to me, that makes it really exciting.
Yeah, part of the team and part of the impact. Well, your next lesson really goes in line with branding, and you say stay consistent. So stay consistent. How did you learn this lesson?
Well, it's funny. A lot of times you'll notice that people will internally will run campaigns or run advertising, and folks will get kind of bored with it. Like, oh, we ran that last quarter, and want to constantly change. And in these larger companies, you'll see product marketing has a style, and the web team has a style, and the campaign team has a style, and the brand team has a style, and it looks like 10 different companies. And, I think one of the core pieces about really building a brand is that consistency. And, I noticed one time when I was hiring somebody from Salesforce, I said, why, I think I was at Oracle at the time. And I said, why are you coming from Salesforce to Oracle? What is it about that interests you? And she said, well, I understand that you're really starting to build the first campaigns, and you're, establishing the brand, and there's a lot of creativity going on. And at Salesforce, everything's cookie cutter. Every video looks the same. Every demo looks the same. Every ad looks the same. And it's all, the road has been paved. And everything has a formula, and it's 100% consistent. And it really occurred to me, while that might be boring, it's the best brands, right, are really true to that brand and true to that consistency, even sometimes I think at the expense of, at innovation. I do find I have to watch that, internally folks will get tired of a brand or an ad campaign, and just have a natural tendency to want to change because it keeps their jobs exciting. But the reality of building a brand is that, consistency is just absolutely critical piece of that.
Well, the reality too is the audience or the customer hasn't seen it nearly as much as we have, right?
That's right.
Like even working on one video, the amount of times you have to watch that video in the editing suite and hear that song over and over, by the time it comes out, you're sick of it. Like the audience hasn't seen your messages that many times, right?
Exactly.
But speaking about staying consistent, so it's hard enough, like you said, it's hard enough to stay consistent within one enterprise. Then when you work in, like you said, acquisitions, when you work in partners, like channel partners, like have you learned anything in terms of value proposition messaging or anything to keep that consistency, across partners or when you're bringing on, a new acquisition? So for example, I wrote a case study about a company called Grasshopper Mowers. So they sell lawnmowers and they sell them through, local dealers. And they were able to increase online lead generated sales 80% by improving the consistency of the path from the website of Grasshopper Mowers to those local dealers, right? Because people weren't like, what's going on here? So, have you learned anything in your career? How do you keep that consistency? Like you said, it's hard enough within the company. How do you keep it across your partners, your channel partners, those acquisitions?
It's hard. I mean, it is hard. And I think, sometimes there are kind of sub brands within a brand, and sometimes you make that conscious decision to do that. But I do think you really have to be a little bit maniacal about really managing that and making sure that you're just not allowing folks to, just because it gives you visibility, kind of take your materials and do with it what they will, and really be very direct about the brand and a little bit precious of the brand. One of the things I loved about the IBM that was interesting, somebody recently said, "Oh, let's put the brand on napkins or on paper cups." And one of the things I learned at IBM is you never put the brand on something disposable, right? Because you don't want to all of a sudden be walking by a garbage can at a conference and the whole garbage can is filled with your brand's discarded cups, right? And so I do think it's really making a point of really limiting exceptions, is really, really critical. And also I think sometimes using agencies can be difficult because sometimes the agencies, their work will look like that agency as opposed to look like your brand. And so really making sure that, that brand is clear. And even if you use different agencies or contractors or outside resources, that, there's a real, very strong brand, style, voice, look, and feel that is, consistent no matter whether you made it in-house or used an agency or had a partner develop something.
Well, that's a lesson I had never heard before. It's a great lesson. Don't put your brand on something disposable. I like that. All right, let's talk about another lesson you learned. Teams that are steeped in data and conversion numbers are the strongest at the craft. I love that. How did you learn that?
Again, I would say this was a bit of a distinction between some of the, the larger, more established brands and these smaller growth style brands. When you have a smaller marketing budget, you're counting on every single dollar and that, getting the ROI out of that dollar, because you better believe someone's going to be asking how much money did you spend and how much did we get? I think at some of the larger brands, there's probably just a little bit more room for waste. I remember Paul McNulty was a CMO of Unica, and I remember at one point early on, I was working with him, and he said, "Tammy, why are we paying double for what anyone else would be paying for these media buys and ad campaigns?" Because when you're at a smaller brand, that ROI, is precious because you're trying to build and scale. And so it's so critical for you to understand what your cost per lead is, so you can understand, how to scale it and make sure that you're bringing in profitable business.
Let me ask you, when I came into marketing, I was a creative. And like I said, I started in print and, didn't have as many, obviously we had results, but not as many metrics, not as much analytics. And people come from other areas, business and all these areas. I wonder if you have any advice for working with data scientists and analytics managers for marketers who skew more creative or business, because we have a free marketing course, and in it, Flint McLaughlin teaches the marketer needs meaningful work and meaningful relationships. And I think there are many meaningful relationships with sales. That's one, for example. But definitely, as you said, with these data folks and these analytics folks, if we're going to do what you just said. So do you have any advice on kind of building those relationships, learning from them, working with them?
Well, I have I've done this in maybe for the last 5 years, maybe a little longer. I have a war room every Thursday, and I sort of borrowed this concept. One time I heard one of the early founders of Netflix talk about when they were building the company that they would have a one-page sheet, and the company had gotten a little bit too big for them to get in a conference room. So they would go out in the parking lot and they would stare at the Netflix numbers. And it was basically, how many, it was back in the day, right? So how many, CDs were mailed, and they would look at the numbers and they would all, it would orient them for how the company was doing every Friday. And I've kind of modeled it along those lines where, a lot of times I'll come in and you'll see, the social team is trying to do social media and drive clicks, and the web team is worried about, the website and time on site, and the content team's worried about great innovative content. But if everyone's not oriented toward those same numbers, then, you potentially could be at odds in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, So, that's nice that we got lots of clicks on social media, but, how many demos did it drive? How many sales did it drive? And so if every person on the team understands that we're all after really the same set of metrics, I think that there's real power in that. So I bring my data scientist in, and every Thursday I have a war room, and we look at all the numbers and we look at them together. And I think that also gives us this kind of collective intelligence on what's working, what's not working, because a lot of times these things work best together, in practice as opposed to, in isolation. Even looking at events and web, online and offline, and looking at them all together and how they're interacting. I think there's real power in that. So I have a scorecard that I come and I align the entire team on the scorecard, and then we look at it once a week. And I do think there's real power in that. And then I report that, up the chain in terms of I get buy-in as well from my CEO and peers in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. And there's power in that as well because we're all aligned in terms of what the goals, there's a lot written about, right? CMOs fail because they're not in alignment with their CEO about what their charter was in the first place. And I think as well, making sure that you've set the goals, and then your data is showing you how you're doing against those goals, both for your business leaders and then also for your marketing team.
Yeah, so I totally on board with you about having your entire team see how a smaller thing they're working on fits into the bigger goal, and obviously reporting the goals around the organization. What about actually understanding the human beings that we call customers better? I mean, this is something metrics and analytics can give us to actually understand those people better for everything from our branding campaigns to our social media campaigns. You had mentioned that you worked with an analytics manager at SoftLayer who said he could almost get inside the minds of a Google searcher. So either from that experience or with your kind of how you're bringing the team together now, like how are you using those numbers to actually understand those human beings better?
Yeah, well, I loved that, because at SoftLayer, I think they made a science out of really understanding who their customers were and understanding them better as a cohort. And so over the years, I've worked to refine, my ability to go after prospects that are in the marketplace. So I do use and this is probably a little old school, but I do use research where I hire a research team to actually interview folks in market for my product. So, for Thryv, we interviewed 10 businesses. They weren't customers, they weren't prospects, they were in the market. They were our core cohort, ideal customer profile, and interview them and really get an understanding about what was their problem, what was their need, and what was the solution that they were looking for. And I think sometimes, too often we kind of go to the product, right? Like, oh, here's what we're selling and here's the value prop. But it really all starts with the problem, right? And the solution that they were looking for in the first place. And I think that's a really important lesson. And I learned that from one of my startup folks. You really need to, even your keyword research, from your paid search to the content that you're creating, you need to make sure that it starts at the beginning of the journey, not meeting them halfway in and talking about a solution. You really need to understand that. And so I think that's a really important piece of it in terms of getting in kind of inside the hearts and minds. And so, doing that research, kind of setting a premise in terms of what you think they're looking for and then testing that. And again, I kind of go back to the worm where we look at, which keyword sets are converting, what solutions that our, customers are looking for are actually converting into close run revenue. So like I could tell you today for Thryv, for the most part, they're having trouble with people not keeping their appointments, or they're having trouble with scheduling and invoicing and things like this because they don't have the technology to do it. And so, we're really hit hard on that in terms of our, the paid search, our SEO that we're driving, our content that we're creating, 10 ways to, keep scheduling, easier for your small business, that kind of a thing, to really find those watering holes where our folks are looking for solutions.
Well, and this is where I always wonder about a CMO's role in an organization too. Like, how far do you get into product development? Because what you're saying is some great customer wisdom that we would lose if we just looked at clicks on a page. Or sometimes we look at win-loss reports, right, with a sales team. Win-loss report, that, to your point, that person got pretty far through your funnel versus the people who don't maybe even know about your company or product, or if you just have that extra feature, you'd pull them in. So as a CMO, that's a lot of business intelligence. Do you use that to work with actually building some new features into the product?
We do. In fact, when we do that research, I did the readout together with my head of product management to stare at that and say, what is it that they're looking for in terms of an overall solution? And, are we hitting on all these cylinders, or, can we not provide the full solution to what, as to what they're looking for? Or, are there watering holes that we're seeing that our product doesn't potentially pay off? Like one of the one of the major issues I'm grappling right now is a lot of times folks are looking for a vertical solution, but the vertical solutions aren't as powerful as a horizontal solution. So, how do you go after those prospects with a solution that's horizontal when they might actually be looking for, plumbing software, right? But that's not really what they need. So, you need to sort of make sure that you meet them where they are a little bit. And so sometimes leaning into that in the way you position the product, I think can be very, very helpful. It's not necessarily that they need a specific product feature. It's that you need to make them understand that this is for them. And sometimes that segmentation turns into hyper segmentation where, instead of 2 or 4 or 5, you need, 30 different segments where you're talking to them in a different voice and addressing a different problem or solution.
Yeah, I mean, that little tweak can make the biggest difference from small business marketing software to plumbing software, right? Because they're probably not searching for small business marketing software.
That's right.
Okay, so you talked about War Room. So now we're going to talk about lessons you learned from people you collaborated with. I think that's the two things we do as marketers. We get to make things. That's an exciting thing I've always felt as a marketer. I've never been like an actuary or podiatrist, but we make things. We make brands. We make campaigns. It's a lot of fun. We make them with people. So let's look at some lessons you learned from the people you made it with. You said it is critical for it all to work together seamlessly. It is critical for all to work together seamlessly via Nathan Huey, CMO of SoftLayer. And you talked about your War Room. I wonder if you got this idea from Nathan, because you talked about him having a digital lab. So what did he do? What do you do? How do they relate? What did you learn?
Well, SoftLayer was a small enough company, and they were all in the same office. And so they had the paid search expert was sitting next to the person who was designing the website, was sitting next to the BDR who was calling down the calls, was sitting next to the, marketing person who was building the campaigns. And so they would all meet every day and they would discuss the strategy and what was converting and what wasn't converting. And, what I realized was, in my organization at the time, we were so large and running so many programs that we really didn't have the connective tissue that we needed in order to make sure that we had that feedback loop all the way from sales to the first touch on the website, what was happening. And so, I kind of said to Nathan, this feels like a digital lab to me. I wonder if we could bring this concept into IBM, and rather than, having lots of different teams working together and maybe you'd have a meeting once a week or something like that, could we actually all get in a studio? And at the time, it was pretty cool because IBM was working on these. They were working on these innovation lab concepts, and so I pitched it as an innovation, and they gave me a studio. And that's what we did. We, I named someone the Scrum manager, and we worked in an agile work group where we said, okay, we're going to set what we're going to do for the month. And then, on a daily basis, we would, kind of work together and take stock and inventory. There was a data scientist on the team, and there was a strategist and a Scrum master and a media specialist and a designer, that kind of a thing. And we would build these demand campaigns. And then at the end of the week, we would, come together and we would do a jury, and we would, there was other labs and lots of other folks there. And at the end of the week, somebody would do a readout and say, okay, here's my, campaign, and we have this new campaign. And, it was really great because you got to have a jury as well on that campaign. And so I'll never forget one time I had this beautiful campaign, and I was so proud of it. And it just really looked fantastic. It was a digital campaign, and a woman standing in the back of the room, I'll never forget, Michelle Killebrew, raised her hand, really strong digital marketer. And she says, I think this is going to break your heart, but I think it's actually too pretty because you're going after, developers, and they hate stuff that looks like marketing. And this really looks like marketing. And as she said it, my heart broke because I knew she was completely right. But, sometimes as I think as a demand marketer, when you're trying to, put programs into market, you really do need someone who hasn't been so involved to stand and really critique your program and be ready for that feedback, good, bad, or indifferent.
It's funny when you talk about everyone sitting in that same room together at SoftLayer. I wonder if you have any advice for distributed teams. A lot of people are working in distributed teams now because IBM, I worked there like in the mid to late 2000s. And even back then I worked from home, and almost everyone did. And we didn't have video like this. So a funny thing I would always do is I would hear someone's voice, in the conference calls, and I would picture in my head what they must look like. And then you'd meet them at Software University or something and be like, okay, was I accurate? Was I not accurate? So, now we have video, which I don't know if it's better or worse, but I don't know if Thryv is distributed, but how do you take that kind of in-person collaboration and make a war room or a digital lab when you have people working perhaps at home or in different offices throughout a region, throughout the world? Any lessons there?
It's really tough. And honestly, for the most part, let's face it, now, post COVID, almost everybody is now working remotely. And, we travel sometimes to be together, but for the most part, on a daily basis, most teams, I'm going to say, I don't know if that's too big of a generalization, are fairly remote. And, what that gives you is access to talent all over the world, which is fantastic. But what you lose is that, in-person daily collaboration. And so, we do try to create these, I create these little hubs where we'll have, a media working sessions and web working sessions. And, then we've got our war room at the end of the week. But it can be difficult. It really can be difficult. We also have different tools, that we use that keep us, we use Miro and Slack and, where we kind of, touch base, I would say, on a daily basis. But I do actually think it makes building a practice a bit more difficult being remote.
Yeah, let me ask you about this next lesson. This also might be something you communicate remotely to your team through a dashboard or something like that. But you said weekly growth is a high bar and a strong motivator. And you learned this from John DeLullo, SVP of sales at ForcePoint. I could see a sales guy wanting to look at weekly numbers. But how did you learn that?
Well, it's interesting. John came in and we said, what are our targets? What are our goals for revenue? Because everyone's used to working that way. And he said, I just want you to improve every week. I want you to improve. And that seemed like, well, okay, we can improve once a week, but there's going to be no plan. And people were sort of very unsettled by that. Well, how can there be no plan? We can't operate without a plan, and what I realized was just getting a little bit better every week was actually a harder bar. And it was, it really showed you your progress. And, it wasn't like you had to wait for the month or for the quarter to find out whether you made the quarter or not. You really once a week were able to see that you were growing the business. And it's very powerful. And I found that also gives you the ability to kind of keep folks actively building momentum, right? So if you look at every channel once a week, all of a sudden, I don't know, 3 weeks go by and you've noticed that the, traffic from webcasts or from email has slowed down. You kind of dig a little deeper and you realize, oh, well, maybe, Sally moved on and took a new job and, actually there were no webcam. You were able to really understand at a tactical level why you're having these dips or why you're increasing momentum, really by looking at what we did last week. I find sometimes it's hard if you look at it on a monthly or quarterly basis to really pin it to what did we do last week and what did that result in this week? I think it's much easier for people to connect the dots in terms of, what were the levers that we pulled last week and how did they work? How much traffic did they drive to the website? How many MQLs did we drive? What kind of momentum did we see? And I do think it's very powerful to look at it that way. And it sort of keeps you as well on your toes. Like if you're, if every week, you're going to, we're going to look at, how many MQLs were driven from your space. It sort of, keeps the fire on a little bit. Like, okay, every week we've got to show some value. We've got to contribute to the pot to make sure that we're increasing and we're growing our business.
So obviously I see the value in that, but let me play devil's advocate for a second, because how do you avoid just running around and just having, the long-term strategy of the week and just pivoting like crazy? And because, there's been a lot of pushback, at a macro level for the stock markets and quarterly earnings reports. People like Warren Buffett have said, hey, these quarterly earnings reports, they're really killing businesses being able to build sustainable businesses. And from my own experience, there's a difference between working for a public company and one that isn't. And I had a chance to work on earnings calls at one point, and getting to work on earnings calls, it's like, wow, like the head of sales and the CMO and the CEO would be beat up if they grew at like 12%. But the analysts, thought they were going to grow up 14%. Like 12% was pretty good growth for that quarter. And the analysts were giving them all heck on this call because they fell a little bit short. And that's quarterly, And so how do you keep from not doing that, like we talked about? Having that big brand ultimately will help. And if you're, a startup, building that kind of momentum in industry is important. but you're going to get pulled into that sales team needs constant leads. That sales team, we need to hit our revenue numbers. So those weekly reports are good, but how do you balance like keeping a long-term growth trajectory going?
Well, ideally, you want to get to a point where $1 in equals 3 out, right? So you can say, okay, we've got our little, engine running here, and if we put, $20 more in, we're going to get X out. And it becomes a bit of a science where we really understand our cost per lead, and you're able to scale with a good amount of confidence that if you add more money into that marketing budget, that you're going to drive X more leads. And so I do think, often you'll see that, a marketing program isn't quite there, right? Where you're putting money in and you're not getting $1 back, and then it's not profitable. But once you get to profitable leads, ideally you're looking at scaling internationally, scaling your programs in terms of the amount of budget allotment. And so, in my mind, it's almost, it might seem like once a week that it feels like maybe, that could scatter the team to worry about weekly results. But I think, I actually look at it a little bit differently, that I think it kind of, you almost want it to, I think of what are those things called? Like a metronome, what is it called? A metronome, right?
Oh, like for a piano player. Yeah. It's ticking back and forth.
Where it becomes this, sort of this, very steady state where you're actually able to understand, your cohorts and how they're going to interact with your ads and your marketing programs, and that scaling becomes actually much easier once you have the formula right.
Well, and where does branding fit into that? Because you said, I totally agree, the cost per lead, and you're kind of building to these numbers. But even if you're not putting it on a napkin that gets thrown out, we shouldn't do that. I agree with that. But, just putting that print ad in the Wall Street Journal, that's just going to, kind of get your brand out there. So then when people actually see the ad on LinkedIn for your webinar, they'll be like, wait, I heard about the company. I don't remember where, right? And then they click and they go through and they get that lead. Like, how do you balance branding in that mix?
It's interesting. I don't know, this could be a controversial statement, but I do think if you have enough money for advertising, like big major media advertising, which, to do in the United States right now is very, very expensive, good for you. And life's going to be a lot easier, right? But often what I find is that you don't have the advertising money to say, all right, Mr. Business Owner or Mrs. Business Owner, we're going to, spend this huge chunk on advertising. And that's, what you're going to get from that is share of voice, unbranded, unaided brand awareness, and they sort of look at you like, and so I tend to like content marketing programs, regional marketing programs, events and webinars and syndicated content, and a little bit of guerrilla marketing, as opposed to spending these huge, advertising, Formula One type buys or Wall Street Journal type buys. And I think, from that, you're able to tie it a little bit more, to the top of funnel, middle funnel, bottom funnel, as opposed to saying, I've got this whole separate brand advertising budget over here, that's buying me those awareness points. And then I've got demand over here. I actually try to tie the two of them together so that cost per lead includes what I'll call top of funnel buys as opposed to brand awareness. And, in theory, right, over time, that leads to this broader brand awareness.
Well, let's talk about one last lesson from a company that can buy those Formula One ads and those Wall Street Journal ads and those Super Bowl ads. This you learned from Sandy Carter, who is a VP at IBM. Constantly push to be innovative and be on the forefront of a new trend. So how did you learn that at IBM?
Well, back then, digital, I'm going to say, was actually really just becoming much more sophisticated, content marketing, influencer marketing, really brands getting behind social media marketing and, activating their employee base to be driving content and social. There were a lot of trends back then where, staying on top of the trends was I think really important, being a first mover. We drove one of the big, first big influencer programs and one of the first, tech conferences from a brand that was, out of 20,000 people in Vegas, and then we activated the employee base, and just the math on 300,000 employees getting activated on social, was really market moving. And I've always thought, if you can get, these all of these tactics have a bit of a hype cycle, right? Where
Yes.
LinkedIn, remember LinkedIn? You read every single message because it was from somebody you knew, and we were connected, and oh, great to meet you on LinkedIn. Now my LinkedIn, it's full of spam, right? It's, I can't keep up with the connections that I get. And then I feel guilty because, later today you'll try to LinkedIn message me and you're behind 700, vendors that were trying to sell something. So, I do feel like trying to stay ahead and figure out, my head is always around what's next? How do I break through all of the noise that's out there? Because there's so much noise. I mean, even content marketing. I mean, I think it was some horrible statistic about how much more content there is than there was, 10 years ago. And so it makes breaking through, just that much harder. And then it was data content. Now it's, you need video content. Now it's, LinkedIn Live just launched, and that's a new platform. And so I do think being an early adopter on some of these new platforms is critical in terms of being able to get your voice through as a brand.
Yeah, so I want to ask about that. So I remember, so you said you learned this from Sandy Carter at IBM. I remember when I was at IBM, Second Life was a big deal. Right. And that was going to be the future, right? And maybe it was still good for them because, they had programmers and type of people that were on there. And now like Meta and Facebook really just seem to be copying them. But I also don't think really Second Life panned out, I would guess, how IBM thought it would or anyone else thought it would. So I love this term hype cycle. So how do you determine where to invest or which of these to go into? And also, how do you not overlook tried and true tactics that might not be as hype filled, but would still work? And I just remember real quick, Vine. That's another one where, oh my gosh, we all got to get on Vine. And, so do you have anything you've learned over the years of, okay, how do I kind of avoid the hype cycle, for lack of a better word, and figure out what is worth my investment and what's not, and not overlook the tried and true?
Listen, as you mentioned, I was on both of those. Guess what?
Did you own an island on Second Life? Did you own some real estate?
Yes, yeah. I did. I'm going to admit it. And they failed. But I think that's part of being a good marketer. You need to not be afraid of failure and you know what? I'm going to jump into it, and maybe it's going to pay off, and maybe it isn't. And some of them are going to pay off, and some of them aren't. TikTok, right, took off, whereas, Vine was sort of dead on arrival. And I don't know that there's maybe someone that was brilliant could forecast which ones are going to live and which ones are going to die. But I would rather, try to test those platforms, get on them early, understand them, and then be ready to get off if you think, what, this isn't working, my audience isn't there. But for the most part, I like to try. I rarely would tell someone on my team who came to me and said, "Oh, we want to try, something new or innovative," to say, no, we're not sure that's gonna take off. I love to hear that people are seeing new trends and seeing emergent trends and want to hop on them. It's rarely with a massive investment, right? It's often with a pilot, and I applaud that type of bravery.
So you mentioned Sandy Carter was the one that really pushed you early into social media, influencer marketing, content marketing. As a CMO yourself, is there anything specifically you do with your team to try to keep them at the cutting edge? Like, some teams, it's like use 5 or 10% of your time to just focus on emerging things, or, some teams it's, testing or, something else. Is there anything you're doing with your team to really kind of keep them pushing that emerging edge and learning those new skills?
I would say I encourage them to, make sure that they're doing outside reading on marketing, studying our competitors. A lot of times, within a category, we probably have, 30 different point vendors in our category. So, I'll often, talk about what the different brands in our category are doing and say, have you seen this? And I audit them. I'm probably in 30 trials at a time, right? I do software trials and I see how they market to me and understand. So I think understanding the competition is really critical. But then that's not going to get you better than the competition, right? So I think I would say I kind of do it by example. I'm constantly looking for marketing success stories and, understanding trends in marketing. And I'll regularly send my team, have we checked this out? Should we think about this? ChatGPT just came out. Are there marketing implications for it? Whatever the heck it is. And I think, I like to think that by, sort of suggesting and pushing that they sort of, when I'm new to a team, often I think they think, oh wow, we have to jump on this right away, and I think they realize that I'm just constantly going to be, suggesting, why don't we try this or that or the other thing, and sometimes they'll just, we'll say not a priority, we're going to pass, and then sometimes they'll, start a project or a pilot. So I guess I like to think it's a lead by example where I'm always looking for innovative or new, and and really like to reward the team for trying new trends or trying new innovations.
Do you have your eye on anything in particular now? You mentioned ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, machine learning. I'm going to put on my outlook in 2033, 10 years from now, to listen back to this episode, Tammy, and see how well you predicted. So no pressure. No pressure.
Exactly. We're right now, a big thing right now is using AI for media buys. And so we're testing some, and you can do, it's kind of worth it because you could do, though, the vendors that are selling these platforms will actually give you a free trial, and they'll say it'll save 15%, on your, 15% improvement on your ROI from ads. And so, the downside is pretty limited of trying it and, and seeing if it works. So I think that's a pretty major trend right now, AI for media buying, because I think that's gotten pretty sophisticated and, I'll say machine driven for lack of a better word. That's one piece. Another piece that and this isn't necessarily so new, but we're really trying to do so much more with video and live and influencers. It's not that it's so new, but I do feel sometimes that's difficult to get scaled and really, get that production to a point where you're leaning more into video than you are into other types of content. And so that's something that I'm always pushing for, because, I think you're competing with, I don't know, how many ebooks are out there, that it's all the blogs, the ebooks. And so I think trying to lean more heavily into influencers with following and videos and live is something that I think can just give you a little bit of an edge in terms of, how you're showing up as a brand. And then now with COVID, dare I say, this isn't the most innovative comment, but getting back in person, I think just pushing people to get back out there in person, because I think people right now want to be in person. They're thrilled to get invited to a dinner or an in-person event, because it's been a while. And I think digital has gotten a little bit crowded, and we're actually seeing really good return from live in-person events.
That's a really good point. Sometimes things swing back the other way where the classic becomes truly innovative,
Yeah.
So, all right, well, Tammy, we talked about so many different things, from knowing the data to trying to innovate to, so what do you think, if you could break it down, what are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
Wow. So the key qualities of an effective marketer. I think one of the things we talked about, I think, is really, really being ready to understand that you might embark on something that's going to fail and not be afraid to do that. So a little bit of bravery in terms of what you're going to put into market and what you're going to go after, and trying to be a little bit provocative or progressive in terms of the programs that you're going to try. Sometimes folks are, want to be safe. They're worried about trying something new. And so I would say that's a big one for me, someone who's ready to sort of try something new and push the envelope a little bit. Two, I think someone who's very data driven, right? You really understand that, especially, today, marketing is very measurable, right? It's less subjective, I would say, than it was, back, 10 years ago. it's really very measurable. And so you really need to understand, no matter what it is, if you're running an event, if it's digital, social, advertising, you really need to be ready to say, here's the program I'm going to run, here's the results I think it's going to drive, and by the way, here's what it drove, and it either failed or it succeeded, and really be very, very numbers focused. And then I think someone very collaborative. The programs, all the marketing takes such collaboration today. That I think it really does take a collaborative individual who's not not sort of a lone player, but can really understand that this is 1 + 1 = 3. Where if we can really partner together on a marketing strategy and execute it in kind with one another, it's likely going to be much more successful than if you try to go it alone.
I love that. I think you may be the first guest to have said bravery. I like the bravery. Very nice. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned so much from this conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.